Hello, and welcome to our Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 2, Episode 17, Sci-Fi in Video Games. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is my friend Greg. Greg joined me as a co-host in Episode 6 of this season about anime science fiction, and I've brought him back to talk about another of his areas of expertise, which is video games. Hello, Greg. Thanks for coming on the show again.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
So, for the listeners, I am not a gamer. I never owned a console. I never played many computer games as a kid besides educational games, and I think the only major developer game I ever bought was Spore. I did get pretty deep into Flash games in their heyday, and in the past couple years I've started watching playthroughs on YouTube, but even those tend to be indie games. And I've never really touched hardcore gaming. So, my first question for you, Greg, since I don't know in detail, how much of a gamer are you?
Ask 3 people and get 5 standards on which to judge the answer to that question. My answer is as much as my current financial situation allows. So I've got the cheap console and an old gaming laptop, and anything I can run on those, I do.
What do you think about indie versus major companies?
I'm seeing a lot of major companies who are producing successful and polished iterations of the same 5 to 10 ideas over and over again. So I'm very thankful that there are indie developers who publish, sometimes a 12th or even a 13th idea. We need both of them. It would be great if there was a little bit more commingling and innovation, but we're limping along, doing the best we can. I don't have a preference one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was one question I did not give you beforehand because I wanted you to answer it cold.
Ooh.
Do you know what was the first video game?
What was the first video game? I won't know the name when I start thinking back to a lot of those very early text-based games. I don't know the names of them. No, I don't know what the first video game is, I guess is the short answer.
Okay. So there's a really good YouTube video by Ahoy about tracking down the first video game, link in the description. And he concluded that the first ever video game was an implementation of checkers on the Manchester Mark I, written by Christopher Strachey in 1952.
Ooh, I would not have put it that early. That's exciting.
Yeah, Manchester Mark I was back when there were about 10 computers in the world.
Wow.
Now, there are a lot of asterisks to that, as he explains in the video. They were non-video computer demo games as early as 1950, and patents filed as early as 1947.
Wow.
But the main thing with that is most of the earlier video games were demos and were implementations of real-world games like checkers, chess, NIM, tic-tac-toe, and if they had a physics engine, tennis. The main exception to that was Space War, which I don't know if you've heard of that.
Name rings a bell. I got into retro game, and now all I can think of is Space Invaders, but that sounds a little complicated if we're talking about 50s computing.
This was 60s, but it was before Space Invaders.
Okay.
Space War was written for the PDP-1 by grad students at MIT in 1962.
Okay.
We know that Space War was the first video game that was played on multiple computers.
Ooh.
It spread from college to college that had PDP-1s. And I couldn't confirm this, but I believe it was the first video game that was ever written for fun rather than as a demo.
That would be, especially you think about some of the early computing days, that would be hard to nail down conclusively because how many people made something for fun and then never told anyone about it. So qualify as the first one made for fun that was then shared with someone outside of where the computer was.
Right. But of course, the thing with the early computers is that the time was very carefully managed.
True. especially since let's see, early 60s, we're still talking number of years before home computing is ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm. Now, where I'm going with this is that Space War was the inspiration for Atari founder Nolan Bushnell to create the first ever commercially marketed video game, Computer Space.
Okay.
That was in 1971, which was 1 year before Pong.
Yeah, that's back there.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm getting at is, in a sense, the very first computer game was a sci-fi game.
Yes. And I was kind of maybe not anticipating the overview of history that I'm not as familiar with, but was anticipating a question of how far back in video games does sci-fi go? And yeah, it's the whole way for sure.
Yeah, which maybe isn't that surprising, considering at the time the only people who could get access to computers were the kind of people who were grad students at MIT.
Yeah, there is some overlap of interest there, but I think it's also like you think about some of the framing and philosophy of sci-fi as it's about, oh, there's this new technology. What does that do to change the world?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're sitting down at a new technology and trying to do something creative, I think there's a fairly simple correlation there.
So video games are probably more familiar to an American audience than anime, and this podcast has a mostly American audience. And probably more familiar, especially for things like cultural background. So if we're going about this like our previous episode, I think the first thing to talk about is the overall place of video games in the culture. And this is something that maybe you know a little bit more about. One thing that always surprises me is how the video games industry is bigger than the movie industry. Or more profitable, or maybe higher gross. I'm not sure exactly. But I've always heard that the video game industry is bigger. And it is true that the price point is higher. The price for a new AAA game was recently up to $70 compared with $10 for the average movie ticket. But I think a lot more people are going to see Avatar: The Way of Water than are going to play Call of Duty. Or am I wrong about that?
I feel like, this is a good example. With Way of Water, I think there was a lot of hype for it, and at the same time, there were a lot of people who, after the first Avatar movie, might have felt they didn't need to watch another romp for unobtainium, and didn't necessarily spring for the ticket. By a similar token, Call of Duty, someone who wants the new one with whatever the new features are is going to get it, and a lot of people who feel like they've played enough won't. So there's a market for both of these that relies on an interest and some amount of existing buy-in. And to that extent, I think video games have more ways to create that buy-in, whether that is the games themselves. You've been watching playthroughs on YouTube. I've been told, and I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I've been told that esports is actually moving more money around than professional conventional sports, or at least than a conventional professional sport. I don't know if
maybe a conventional sport, and I'd be doubtful if we're talking either version of football.
I thought it was American football when I was told this, which is a wild thing to contemplate, and part of why I'm couching it with so many qualifiers, because I'd love to see the numbers on it before I say it unequivocally. But people watch, sponsors invest, and people buy and play alone in their home with no one watching. There's a number of ways to get someone to engage monetarily with games, whereas with movies, I don't want to say that there's only one way to consume them, but it's usually simpler to just watch it rather than try to reinvent the wheel on how to engage with a movie.
And just for reference, I believe esports has made a serious attempt to get into the Olympics.
That rings a bell. It's interesting to watch the evolution of what things are and aren't Olympics and how much that relies on public opinion. And this is more sci-fi and movies than it is esports, but I remember that there were a number of Oscars that the original Tron was passed over for because they felt like the amount of computer assistance they had was cheating, even though they were inventing a bunch of exciting technologies that we now rely on for almost every movie. Although, boy, they were making those animations direct to film before there were graphic interfaces on the computers they were making the animations on. It's not relevant to the current episode, but boggles my mind nonetheless.
But I want to explore the absolute numbers of people further, because I do think more people will see Avatar: The Way of Water than, I would say, probably own a particular console at least.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit, because while you do not own a console per se, you've got, I'm assuming that with us video chatting one another, that you have a computer of some description, and you probably also have a phone, and even the old flip phones you could run Snake or Pong on. Console gaming is not the only gaming, and there are going to be people who tell you that mobile gaming is somehow less valid or hardcore or authentic, but it's also like the biggest and most rapidly growing type of gaming right now, just because everyone has a phone. Like there was a couple of summers when just a wild number of people were playing Pokemon Go and breaking into places to try and get at gyms. So on the one hand, most people won't own multiple. Some people won't own one console, but nearly everyone has something in their house that can run a video game.
I suppose I should have made the distinction between casual gaming and hardcore gaming, or maybe console versus non-console gaming, where console gaming is a bit narrower.
Agreed. Talking about those like hooks and buy-ins, console exists for people who have a reason to buy a second or a separate and usually pretty expensive object to play games on. So there's someone who has a lot of buy-in investment identity-wise in it already if they're getting a console. For a lot of folks, there was a brief season where consoles were more convenient for getting streaming platforms onto your TV before that became baked into most modern TVs. And I think at that point, a lot of people just decided to have a console in the house all the time.
And in terms of culture, this is getting at something I talked about in my interview with Margaret Whitecamp, where if you look at, for example, television today, content is much more siloed into individual streaming services. And of course, if you look at books, they rarely get Hollywood levels of sales numbers. But if you look at movies, we're still getting multiple billion-dollar blockbusters every year. So Hollywood seems like more of a monoculture. And looking at video games, I was wondering where they fall on the spectrum, but it seems like they sort of have a spectrum of their own, where everybody has mobile games or other casual games, but relatively fewer people have consoles.
Yeah, I would say that that's a fair assessment. Although, by a similar token, there are people who go as hardcore about the mobile games. The person with the most points, for lack of a better way of summarizing it, in Pokemon Go has a huge selection of tablets and phones that he's playing multiple iterations simultaneously on as he bikes around town. So you can still, in the more casual adjacent corner of it, put that big investment into it.
So, talking about sci-fi games in particular, it seems natural to me that video games would be disproportionately sci-fi and fantasy, since that lets developers give the characters special powers.
Yeah, I'd say that tracks a lot in terms of making an interesting way of telling a story. And like we talked about in terms of, especially in the early days, a lot of the devs already having an interest or an investment in those sorts of topics.
Talking about genres of video games, would you say that science fiction is a distinct genre of video games, or does it make more sense to classify them by style of gameplay first, like first-person shooter, role-playing game, real-time strategy, MMO?
Almost. Style of gameplay is a pretty important classification, but not exactly genre so much as experience is kind of a more important one. So if you say something is a horror game, it can be different genres or different play styles, but that prepares you for something very different heading in than if it is I guess this would be a play style thing, because I can't think of a horror racing game. Challenge for any listeners, if you can think of a way to do a horror racing game. Oh, no, wait, actually, there was a game where you operated a train and were running away from an evil brand name safe Thomas the Tank Engine. So that did incorporate almost some racing elements to it. Never mind, I stand corrected. So sort of play experience to flag to the customer, what brain chemicals is this good for? Is this good for the panic, stressful brain chemicals and the letdown after that? Is this good for just chilling and not thinking? Is this something to share amongst friends? And that is kind of a combination of genre, play style, and just sort of tone and theme. So you kind of need all of them to know what it is you're looking for at a certain time.
So in terms of cultural impact, what I'm concluding from this, which is maybe something you might not think when you hear the word, is that gaming is an industry that has something for everyone.
Yeah, that's how they build themselves. There's been a recent push to try and, partly just to keep the lines going up and partly also to try and build more inclusive and understanding spaces, expand markets that weren't traditionally associated with gaming, people who weren't necessarily in those computer labs in the 60s and 70s.
And so since gaming has this wide reach, I think it's worth investigating what effect it has on the culture and the rest of the media. And one thing that strikes me is, how do video games affect narrative conventions? Because, of course, video games are interactive, but most of them, except MMOs, have a single storyline and maybe just some alternate endings.
Yeah, a lot of them. I think because of that interactive nature, it's a lot easier to build different endings. There's value in that from a developer perspective and a customer perspective. If you've got more replay value, if there's an incentive to keep playing through, things that you'll miss if you take a particular story fork on one playthrough. So I think more in RPGs than in any other medium, but an increasing amount with some of the emphasis on getting certain achievements. There will be, this achievement precludes you from getting another achievement, so you'll have to do multiple playthroughs to get all the different branches on that tree. And sometimes that's a strictly mechanical thing, sometimes that's a story thing. So in terms of how it plays with conventions, there is room to play around differently and more. And at the same time, sometimes it is kind of refreshing and simple when they just tell a story and don't need you to, you're not writing it to play through the game multiple times, but there is sometimes I'm playing games to relax and not have to check all of the boxes that the game provides. What if instead the game checked boxes for me? I don't know. Yeah, there's room for both. There's things you can innovate more with in that medium, or innovate differently with. And there's also times when that's not exactly the thing you're going for.
Although I don't know that it's bled out much into traditional media. It's not like we've seen a resurgence of choose your own adventure books or something.
Yeah, I think it has settled into that niche, and there isn't a push to ask the question of how can we take these innovations and apply them in other media, with the possible exception of tabletop games, just because that has a much more open and nonlinear format. It's easy to create pretty simple one-to-ones between a video game structure and a tabletop structure.
Okay, let's look at sci-fi games in particular. And of course, we've established this as a very big part of the video games industry. But are there any particular games you think stand out there?
Like signposts over the years wise?
Mm-hmm. Or is that even the right way to think about it?
That's a fair way to think about it. Missile Command was an early sci-fi game. You're shooting incoming missiles, but there is no end state to the game aside from loss. So you get a very simple mechanic with a very stressful story that always ends in nuclear destruction. So it's an interesting, like, this was, I think, first published to one of the Ataris, but it's an interesting little quirk of here's a simple mechanic with a surprisingly dire story to it. One of my favorites, although it tends to be more fantasy, it does blend in a lot of sci-fi elements, is Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo. The main focus and the big gimmick and mechanic is time travel. So you change things in the past to alter where things are or how accessible they are in the present, and eventually you are fighting robots and mutants in the future and jumping back to try and prevent the dominant race of reptiles from wiping out mammals in the past. And there's also magic and wizards and extraterrestrial psychic beetles, but a little bit of everything for whoever wants it, and a really great soundtrack. Around the same time, the first Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, around the same time, kind of was a leap forward in technology. The story, partly because I was very young when I played through it, and partly because, no, that was the main reason. Because I was very young when I played through it, I didn't internalize a lot of the story, but the change in technology, the shift basically into a lot of the modern 3D technology, which you were seeing versions of in other spaces around that time. But the first Star Fox did a lot to sort of mainstream that. From a signposts perspective, the next one that leaps out to me in a big way, we mentioned the Metal Gear series earlier. That popped up during the early PlayStation days, and again includes sci-fi elements and includes Hideo Kojima's unique brand of things just happen and people are given wild names and explanations for why their clones need to behave the way they do. But an iconic moment in the progression of sci-fi games, nevertheless, which would probably bring us to the next big one being Halo, which there's a lot about it that's a lot of it feels trite in hindsight. I think on your first pass, some of the plot twists hit a lot better than they do now. And it did a lot to say, here's a console shooter, which the biggest ones of those had been either movie adaptations or built on the engine of movie adaptations. Here's a unique sci-fi story with a very polished console shooter with a strong emphasis on local multiplayer. It did a lot to sort of mainstream gaming and the idea of playing games with people, it being a thing you didn't need to hide or be nerdy about, but you were all big, burly space people doing big, burly space people things together as a group, sharing in that. And that was neat. Although I should say I almost branded it as in some ways more significant than GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. Perfect Dark being the more sci-fi of the two, GoldenEye being a movie adaptation. And there are people who Perfect Dark is like their favorite shooter, so they will be upset if I make it seem like Halo is better than it. It's technologically more polished, but does not have as much heart. From there, Halo also marks the beginning of, since it was published on a Microsoft console, the big companies starting to see the profitability of gaming and how if they just started churning things out in the same formula, it was pretty straightforward to make more of the same thing and make that profitable. So for me, I get a little bit jaded about what signposts come after that. Kerbal Space Program. Argument could be made that it's not very sci-fi and it's more physics simulator, but it marks someone doing innovative stuff with themes of space travel and technological development, even if that innovative thing is strap as many things together as you want and throw them at the moon. That's a great game.
I never played it myself, but there were a lot of physics people who did.
Yeah, I'm sure it made the rounds, and I'm sure it was equal parts amusing and frustrating for folks in your field. The big things about it were like encouraging creativity and having just really dorky, adorable things happening on screen. There's probably something like recent and modern that I should remember and am kicking myself for forgetting.
Mm-hmm. And at this point, I'm wondering if it even makes sense to talk about this on this show and not a gamer's history of science fiction. And I am not the person to create a gamer's history of science fiction.
Fair enough. Those are the big ones that I think of signpost-wise and history of it wise.
So maybe my next question is more relevant, which is, has sci-fi as a genre had some kind of influence on the gaming industry besides just tie-in games? And has gaming influenced the larger sci-fi genre in some way?
Yes. Like we said when discussing your ambush question at the beginning, the people who have been developing games are often people with an keen interest in a lot of the underlying questions of sci-fi. So they get a really fun personal canvas to explore a lot of those questions on, personal for them and personal for the eventual customer, in terms of you then get to take on some sort of role in this space, whether that space is literal outer space or just another type of sci-fi story. Aside from just tie-ins, I mean, also these things lend themselves to stories about each other. There's been sci-fi about what happens when video games become X, famously Ready Player One. But cutting back to my last episode, there's also a lot of anime on the theme of, oh no, everyone's been trapped in an MMO. If you die in the video game, you die in real life, that sort of thing. Because the technology for video games feels a market need to constantly develop, and because a lot of sci-fi is circling around questions of what happens when technology develops to a certain point, they sort of feed each other a little bit. You need some outside pushes to make it really compelling, some third leap aside from, or some second leap aside from just, oh, video games did this, and this therefore must mean tremendous upheaval for society, because that's a little bit much for most suspension of disbelief to swallow. But I think they feed each other well, and there are definitely instances where you can see, oh yeah, that's drawing a big influence from this publication or from these games, and this is talking about these subjects raised by these games, these genres, that sorts of thing.
And I touched on this a bit in the previous episode, where you're seeing a lot of science fiction these days about virtual reality and artificial intelligence, and that goes back to things like The Matrix, but you have Ready Player One and Ready Player Two more recently, and you have even some children's movies that are parodies of the tech industry. That's sort of asking these questions about what is the influence more of AI, but also of virtual reality on society.
There are a lot of video games also that do play around with the question of AI and of like a lot of the tropes you see in sci-fi discussing AI or any other sci-fi discussion. I remember a lot of different, not just the most recent one with the genre in the title, but there's a lot of different cyberpunk video games that explore those questions. There's a lot of transhumanist video games that explore the questions of what if we replace our parts or ourselves with robot parts. There was a very fun RTS in the 90s, real-time strategy game called Total Annihilation, which the background story had to do with transhumanism, but it never really showed up as a gameplay element, so that probably doesn't count, but it was fun.
I think the biggest one I've heard of for transhumanism is Deus Ex.
Mm-hmm. Which covers a lot of those issues, and maybe not as much in the more recent ones, but the original one more so, also does a lot of the cyberpunk stuff as well. In Deus Ex, I'm remembering there being a big emphasis on discussions about what it means when corporations hit a certain size and if the only resistance available is cyberpunk-style espionage and digital terrorism, although them being shooter games, it does not stay strictly digital. Those sorts of questions and living in that sort of specific brand of dystopia, or being set in that specific brand of dystopia, and trying to make your way through that as best you can. I think one interesting thing you see is that when an author or a game creator feels like someone in sci-fi or someone in games has made something ubiquitous enough that they no longer need to explain it at the beginning of their media, you then start seeing it more often in one or the other. I think there are enough different popularly understood types of faster than light travel now that you can say, oh, this is some sort of a jump or some sort of a slipstream or some sort of a hyperspace, and there's some understanding of what those all mean discrete from one another. I think one thing that you can say without a whole lot of specific examples is if you have a genre you enjoy and you're consuming media of it, that impacts your creative process a lot. So I'm imagining that a lot of sci-fi game makers are reading a lot of sci-fi and vice versa. Maybe not as many writers playing games, but I bet you for sci-fi it's a closer number than it might be for some other genres.
Well, I think that's a good overview of the subject. I may come back to it later if I think of a more specific topic to cover, but this should probably get you started for the listeners. Now, I do try to end with a recommendation, but I'm not entirely sure which way to go with that.
I'm going to go back and say Chrono Trigger. It is available on, I believe, on mobile and on Steam. Those are ways to acquire it legally and moderately ethically, although there are complaints about some of those adaptations. But it is a very fun setting. It plays around with a lot of fun sci-fi and fantasy ideas, and the music and presentation are some of my favorite from any video game ever. It's a little old for some people's tastes. It's like from the mid-90s, and I don't know what to tell you. It's good in spite of that, because of that, whichever you feel like.
Mm-hmm. And how much of a learning curve is there for non-gamers like me?
There will be a moment of bumbling while you understand the controls for top-down perspective. Once you figure out that, there are menu options to speed up or slow down the speed of combat so that can be taken at a digestible pace. But a lot of the main things is just using arrow buttons to move your guy around, talking to people, and reading the story. All skills which I hope you already have from science fiction.
Okay. And if someone is more interested in playthroughs, would you recommend finding a playthrough of Chrono Trigger or looking for something else?
I'm pretty confident that there are a number of playthroughs of it available. Yeah, that feels like a nice place to start. I would say playthroughs of that. There are also, if you want to see what I'm alluding at with the weirdness of the Metal Gear Solid games, there's a lot of playthroughs of those available as well. If you both wanted to know what that was about or found 2D games offensive and didn't want to stick around for Chrono Trigger.
Okay, sounds good. Greg, thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, thank you again.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction. I'm on Twitter and Mastodon at SciMeetsFiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. The next episode will be a catch-up, still a few of these left to do, and I will be reviewing recent sci-fi action movies. Thanks for listening.